Grace Whitaker did not scream when her brother tied her wrists. She had already used up every word she had. She only looked down at her swollen belly, pressed one hand against the kick she felt beneath her ribs, and made herself a promise so quiet that no one in that frozen road heard it. I will not let them take her. If a story about one woman's fight to keep herself and her child alive in the coldest winter of 1886 is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe to this channel. Follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rope was her brother's idea. Samuel Whitaker had thought of everything except the part where Grace stopped crying. He had expected tears. He had prepared for begging. He had even rehearsed something to say when she called him a coward, something about bad luck and worse timing, and how a man had to do what a man had to do when the cards went wrong 3 nights running and the debt collector had a face like a closed fist. But Grace had not cried. She had looked at the rope in his hands, looked at his face, and gone very still, in the way she used to go still as a girl, when their father raised his voice, that long, slow stillness that meant she was putting something away inside herself where it could not be reached or broken. "Samuel," she said, "I am 8 months along." "I know what you are," he said, and he looped the rope around her wrists anyway. It was December in Montana, 1886, and the cold had come down from the mountains 3 weeks early, like it had a grudge. The wagon road that ran between Harlan Creek and the town of Delwood was frozen solid underfoot, rutted with old wheel tracks that had locked into the ground like scars. Grace's boots were thin. She could feel every ridge through the soles as Samuel walked her out of the farmhouse she had shared with her late husband Daniel for 4 years, out past the chicken coop that still had Daniel's initials carved in the post, out to where Silas Crow was waiting, with 2 men and a canvas-covered wagon. Silas Crow was not a large man, which surprised people the first time they saw him. He had a quality of compactness about him, like a thing that had been compressed into a smaller space than it wanted, and that compression had made it harder and meaner than it would otherwise have been. He wore a good coat. He always wore a good coat, Grace would later learn, because the coat was part of the business. It told people he was legitimate, that whatever transaction he was proposing was the kind of transaction a respectable man would enter into. He looked at Grace the way a man looks at something he has already paid for and is calculating the shipping cost. "She's further along than you said," he told Samuel. "She's healthy," Samuel said. "Strong. She ran the whole farm herself after Daniel passed. She can work." "I can hear you," Grace said. Neither man looked at her. "The term stand," Crow said. "Debt cleared my ledger, closed your name off the paper. You said she had no family left to come looking. No one who'd bother," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not quite shame, but the place where shame would have been in a man who had more of it. Grace turned to look at her brother then. She studied his face the way you study a piece of land you thought you knew and have just discovered you were wrong about entirely. "Samuel," she said, "I am carrying Daniel's child. Your blood. Whatever you think this is, whatever paper this man showed you, whatever he told you was legal, you are standing in front of God and these 2 men and selling your sister." Samuel looked at the frozen ground. "It's a work contract," he said. "It ain't." "It is what it is," Crow said pleasantly, and nodded to one of his men who stepped forward and took Grace's arm above the elbow. The grip was practiced, impersonal, the grip of a man who had done this before. "Load her," Crow said. "We lose light in 2 hours." Grace did not fight in that first moment. She had learned in the month since Daniel died that the first moment was not the moment to spend your strength. She let the man walk her toward the wagon. She counted her steps. She calculated the distance to the tree line. The state of the road, the weight she was carrying, the cold, the 2 other men, and the fact that her wrists were bound in front of her rather than behind. Bound in front was a mistake on Samuel's part. It meant her hands were together. It meant that when the man holding her arm turned to say something to Crow, she could use both hands to grab the iron bracket on the wagon's side rail, the sharp one, the one that held the canvas tarp in place, and drag the rope across it. The rope did not cut through, but it frayed. and it bit into her wrist, and she felt the warm bloom of blood against the cold, and she pulled again, and the frayed section gave, and then she was running. She was 8 months pregnant, and running on a frozen road in thin boots, and she knew she could not outrun 2 men on horseback, but she ran anyway, because the alternative was the canvas wagon, and whatever waited at the other end of it. And Grace Whitaker had made a promise to the child beneath her ribs, and she intended to keep it. She made it 40 yards before her ankle turned on a frozen rut, and she went down hard on her hands and knees, and the impact knocked the breath out of her so completely that for a moment there was nothing. No cold, no fear, no sound, just white. Then sound came back. Boots on frozen ground. Crow's voice irritated rather than alarmed. "Bring her back. Don't damage her." Grace pushed herself up. Her palms were bleeding where she had caught herself on the road. Her knees were screaming. The baby had gone still in that alarmed way babies go still when something happens to the body carrying them, and that stillness frightened her more than anything else. "Easy," said the man who reached her. "Easy now. No one's going to hurt you if you don't make it difficult." "Don't," Grace said, and she said it in the voice she had used exactly once before, the night a drifter had come to the farm and Daniel had been in town, and she had stood in the doorway with a shotgun she barely knew how to operate, and used a voice she had not known she had. "Don't put your hands on me again." The man paused, not because he was moved by it, but because the voice was strange enough, certain enough, that it created 1 second of hesitation. Grace used that second to get her feet under her and stand up. She was bleeding from both palms and one wrist. She was standing in the middle of a frozen road, 8 months pregnant, with no coat that would actually keep her warm, and 2 men between her and the tree line, and a third man on a horse watching from 20 feet away. She had nowhere to go. She knew she had nowhere to go. She stood up anyway. "Samuel!" she called, not to beg, but because she wanted him to watch. "Look at what you've done." Her brother did not answer. He had turned his face away. Crow made a small sound of impatience. "Pick her up," he said. 3 miles north on the ridge above the Delwood Road, Elias Boone was mending a stretch of fence line that had no business being mended in December weather, which was exactly why he was doing it. Elias Boone was the kind of man who worked harder when something was bothering him, and something had been bothering him for 4 days. He couldn't have told you what it was. That was part of what bothered him. It was the feeling a man gets sometimes in open country. A kind of weight in the air that has nothing to do with weather. A sense that something somewhere is wrong and waiting. He was 36 years old. He had been a ranch foreman in Wyoming, a cattle driver in Kansas, and for the last 2 years he had been riding fence line for the Carver spread in Montana, which paid enough and asked little enough that it suited him. He was not a man who made friends easily or wanted to. He was not a man who explained himself. He had a reputation in Delwood for being quiet and fair, and the kind of trouble you did not want to start if you had any sense. He pulled the wire taut, hammered the staple, stood back, and looked down at the road below the ridge. He almost missed it. It was the red against the white that caught him. Small marks on the frozen road, not enough to be dramatic. Not a scene, just dots of red on pale ground. Irregular, the pattern of something that had fallen and gotten up and kept moving. And then 30 yards further, a longer smear where something had gone down on both hands. Elias looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the wagon on the road, still visible at the far end, moving away. He did not decide to follow in any conscious, deliberate way. He simply gathered his tools, mounted his horse, and rode down from the ridge. He followed the blood. The line cabin on the north end of the Carver spread had not been used since September. It was small and cold and smelled of old wood and mouse nests, and when Elias pushed open the door with his boot and Grace Whitaker saw the interior of it, she made a sound in her throat that she immediately suppressed. She had not gone quietly back to the wagon. She had gone loudly and fighting, which had earned her a bruise on her left arm and a cut on her cheek from the side of the wagon gate, neither of which she had been able to prevent, and both of which Elias had catalogued in silence from the moment he intercepted the wagon on the road and placed himself and his horse between it and the tree line and said in a voice that was perfectly level and perfectly final, That's far enough. Crow had started with the contract. He always started with the contract. This woman is under a legally binding work agreement, and the man riding alongside you is legally authorized. Show me, Elias said. I beg your pardon. The paper. Show me the paper. Crow had looked at him with the evaluating look of a man deciding how much trouble this was going to be. Elias Boone was not the largest man he had dealt with, but he had the specific quality of stillness that told Crow the cost of moving him would be higher than it looked. You have no authority to. I have a badge, Elias said, which was not entirely accurate. He had been a deputy sheriff in Wyoming for 8 months, 6 years ago, and he still had the badge because he had never gotten around to giving it back. And I have 2 questions. First, where is she going? Second, did she agree to go? The 2 men flanking the wagon had looked at Crow. Crow had made the calculation. This isn't finished, he said. That's not an answer to either question, Elias said. Crow had signaled his men to move off. He had done it with the practiced ease of a man who knows when to withdraw and when to return. And the way he looked at Grace before he turned his horse told her that he was not done, only postponed. Elias had not spoken to her during the ride to the cabin. He had given her his coat without preamble, simply pulled it off and held it out, and when she hesitated he said, "It's cold," as if that settled every possible question about the gesture. She put it on. Inside the cabin, he lit the stove without asking her anything, filled the pot with snow from the bucket by the door, and then stood with his back to the opposite wall and said, "I need to clean those." He meant her hands, the palms, the wrist where the rope had cut. "I can do it myself," Grace said. "I know you can," he said. "I'd still like to, if you'll let me." She studied him the way she had studied Samuel on the road, except this time she was looking for something different. She was looking for the price. She had lived long enough to know that kindness from a stranger almost always had a price, and she wanted to find it now while she still had enough strength to refuse it. She did not find it, which frightened her almost as much as Crow's contracted patience. "Why did you stop them?" she asked. Elias set the water on the stove. "Because you were bleeding on the road, and no one else was doing anything about it." "There's more to it than that." "Not as much as you'd think," he said. "That man had papers," Grace said. "My brother signed something. Crow said it was legal." "Your brother sign it for you, or did he sign it for himself?" Grace was quiet. "A man can't sign away another person," Elias said. "Doesn't matter what the paper says. That's not law. That's not anything except what one man wants another man to believe long enough to get what he's after." "Crow believes it's legal." "Crow knows exactly what it is," Elias said. "That's why he's careful about where he operates." Grace looked at the stove. The water was starting to move. "He said he'd come back." "He will." "You can't stop him every time." "Not alone," Elias agreed. He said it so simply that Grace looked up sharply, expecting some plan, some offer wrapped in the expectation of gratitude. But he was just stating a fact. Alone, one man on a fence line could buy her one afternoon. It was a fact, and he treated it like one. "There's a circuit judge," he said, "named Price. He comes through Delwood in 8 days. He's the kind of judge who cares what contracts actually say." He paused. "I've been on this range 2 years. I know the country between here and town. I know where Crow's men don't ride. You're offering to take me to the judge." "I'm offering to take you where you want to go," he said. "If that's the judge, then yes." "And what do you want in return?" He handed her the cloth he had soaked in the warm water. He waited until she took it before he answered. "Nothing," he said. "There isn't anything I want from you." Grace pressed the cloth to her palm. The warmth was so sharp against the cold that her eyes went wet, and she looked at the stove so he would not see it. "My name is Grace Whitaker," she said. "Elias Boone," he said. "You hungry?" She woke at 3 in the morning with the baby moving, not the alarmed stillness from the road. The baby was moving the way she moved when she was simply awake and restless and making her presence known, and Grace lay in the bunk with her hand on her belly and breathed until the movement slowed. The fire in the stove was still going. Elias had kept it fed without waking her, and the cabin was warm enough that she had slept properly for the first time in a week. He was asleep in the chair near the door, his coat thrown over her without her noticing. When he took it back, his hat tilted down over his face, one hand resting near, but not on the rifle, leaning against the wall beside him. Near, but not on. Not a man expecting trouble to find him. A man prepared for it if it did. Grace looked at the ceiling of the cabin and thought about Daniel, who had been a good man and a fair husband, and who had died of a fever in October, and left her alone in the farmhouse with 4 cords of wood and a baby coming, and no idea what the land's legal status would be once the bank got involved. She thought about Samuel, who she had known her entire life, and who had stood on a frozen road and turned his face away while a man put his hands on her. She thought about the baby, who she had decided was a girl because she needed her to be. She thought about Elias Boone, who had cleaned her hands without asking for anything, who had given her his coat in the cold, who was sleeping in a chair with one hand near a rifle, and who had said, "I'm offering to take you where you want to go," like it was the simplest thing in the world. She thought about the fact that in 8 days, a judge would come to Delwood. She thought about Crow's ledger, which she had seen on the seat of the wagon when they loaded her, a plain brown ledger, the kind any merchant might carry, and about what might be in it, and what a judge who cared what contracts actually said might do with its contents. Grace pressed her hand against her daughter's movement, and made the same promise she had made on the road. Quieter this time, steadier. "I will not let them take you. And when we reach that judge, I am going to make sure that what Silas Crow has done to me and to every other woman in that ledger is the last thing he does to anyone." She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind came down from the mountains and rattled the door of the cabin, and Elias Boone shifted slightly in his chair without waking, and his hand did not move from where it rested near. But not on patient and prepared, and the fire in the stove kept burning through the dark and the cold of a Montana December night. In the morning, they would have to move. In 8 days, a judge would arrive in Delwood, and Grace Whitaker, who had been sold on a frozen road by the last person in the world who should have touched her, had a ledger to find, and a name to speak out loud in front of witnesses, and a daughter to bring into a world that was going to be, no matter what it cost her, better than the one she'd been sold into on that road. She had already decided. The only thing left was everything else. The morning came without warning, the way mornings do in Montana in December. Not gradual, not gentle, but a hard gray light that pressed through the cabin's single window and landed on Grace's face like a cold hand. She was already awake. She had been awake for an hour, sitting up in the bunk with her back against the wall and her hands folded over her belly, running the same calculation she had been running since 3 in the morning. 8 days to Delwood. Crow's men on the road. The ledger she had seen on the wagon seat. The judge whose name Elias had said with the particular tone a man uses when he means this one actually matters. Elias was no longer in the chair. The chair was empty, the door was cracked an inch, and from outside came the sound of boots on frozen ground and the low, patient voice of a man speaking to a horse. Grace pushed herself up, straightened her dress, pulled her hair back with her fingers, and walked to the door. Elias was at the horse's head, checking the animal's left foreleg with the kind of focused attention that meant he had already found something he didn't like. He did not look up when she pushed the door wider. "How bad?" she said. "Not bad, tender. We can ride, but not fast." "Can we ride fast enough?" He looked up then. He had that quality of looking at a person directly without softening it that Grace had decided the night before was either the most honest thing about him or the most unsettling, and she had not yet determined which. "Crow knows this range," Elias said. "But I know it better. Fast isn't always the answer out here." "What is the answer?" "Smart," he said. "And early." He stood, dusted his hands on his trousers. "You eat anything last night?" "I wasn't hungry." "You are now," he said, and it was not a question, and he was right, and she hated that he was right. He had cornbread wrapped in cloth in the saddlebag, which was not warm, but was food and dried venison that was tough enough that Grace had to work at it, and water from a canteen that had been sitting near the stove and was still almost warm. They ate standing because sitting felt like staying, and neither of them wanted to stay. "I need to ask you something," Grace said. "Go ahead. Last night you said Crow knows what he's doing, that he knows it isn't legal." She pulled a piece of venison apart with more force than it needed. "How many women has he done this to?" Elias was quiet long enough that she knew he had thought about it before. "The ledger would tell you," he said. "I saw the ledger." "I know you did." Grace looked at him. "You saw me look at it." "I saw you memorize where it was sitting," he said. "That's different from looking." She felt something shift in her chest. Not quite surprised, because she had already started to understand that Elias Boone noticed things and said less about them than most men would, but something adjacent to surprise. Something like being seen clearly for the first time in a very long while. "I want that ledger," she said. "I know." "If we get to the judge without it, Crow produces his contract and calls me a runaway worker, and the whole thing becomes my word against a man with papers." "Yes. The ledger has names, women, dates, amounts. It proves this isn't one contract, it's a pattern." "Grace," Elias said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and he said it the way a man says a name when he wants the person wearing it to slow down enough to listen. "I know all of that. I've been thinking about it since last night, too." She waited. "Crow's wagon is camped 3 miles south near the Harlan Creek Bend," he said. "He didn't leave the territory last night. He pulled back because he's deciding whether I'm worth the trouble or whether he should wait until I'm somewhere else. And the ledger is in that wagon. Most likely. Then we need to go south before we go north." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You are 8 months pregnant," he said, not as an objection, just as a fact he was putting into the calculation. "I am aware of that," Grace said. "I've been aware of it for 8 months. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape a smile leaves behind. "We ride south," he said, "but we do it my way." "What's your way?" "Quiet," he said, "and we don't stop moving." His way turned out to mean cutting through the eastern edge of the Carver spread through pasture that had not been touched since the fall cattle drive, and showed no wheel tracks, no boot prints. Nothing that said a human being had passed through in weeks. Grace rode behind him on a second horse he had retrieved from a small shelter behind the cabin, a sturdy gray animal that moved steadily and without complaint, which Grace decided she respected enormously. She watched the back of Elias's shoulders as they rode. He moved with the horse the way men do who have spent so much time in the saddle that the two things have become one thing. He did not fidget. He did not talk to fill silence. He was simply alert constantly, and without display, his eyes moving across the country around them in long, patient sweeps. "Tell me about Judge Price," Grace said, keeping her voice low. "Came through here twice before," Elias said, not turning around. "First time threw out a water rights contract that 3 ranchers had signed under pressure. Second time prosecuted a land agent who had been forging deeds for 6 years. He's not bought." "Not that I've found," Elias said. "And I've been looking because a man in his position in this territory, it'd be easy to be bought. So far, he seems to just be what he looks like." "Which is what? A man who reads the actual law." Grace absorbed that. "My brother," she said, and she stopped because there were too many places that sentence could go. She picked the most important one. "Samuel will say the contract was voluntary. He'll say I agreed." "Did he tell you what you were agreeing to?" "He told me I was signing a work agreement for a respectable household in Billings," Grace said. "He said it would cover his debt and I'd send money home until the farm got back on its feet." She paused. "I didn't sign anything. He signed my name himself." Elias stopped his horse. It was so sudden that the gray horse behind him startled and tossed her head, and Grace grabbed the mane and steadied her before she realized Elias had already turned in the saddle and was looking at her with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, but something that combined the two. "He forged your signature," Elias said. "Yes." You're sure? Samuel never had good penmanship, Grace said, and I saw the paper when Crow held it up. The G in Grace curves the wrong direction. Elias turned back to the front. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's not a work contract dispute. That's forgery. That's criminal. I know what it is, Grace said. Price will know what it is too. If we can get in front of him, Grace said, and if we have the ledger. Elias urged his horse forward. Then let's go get it. The wagon was where he said it would be pulled off the road at the bend in Harlan Creek, half hidden behind a stand of cottonwoods that had dropped all their leaves and stood bare and gray against the sky. One of Crow's men was visible near the front of the wagon, walking a slow circuit with his hands in his coat pockets. The second man was inside the wagon. Grace could hear him moving the creak of wood and the occasional thump of boots on the wagon bed. Crow himself was not visible. He's in the trees on the south side, Elias said very quietly, watching the road. How do you know? Because that's where I'd be, he said. They were flat in the frozen grass on the ridge above the creek, close enough that their breath made the same small cloud. Grace had protested the crawling part, not because of pride, but because of what happened to her center of gravity at 8 months. And Elias had said with the particular calm of a man who was not going to argue about it, then we don't get any closer than this. The ledger, Grace said. Where in the wagon? Front left, below the seatboard. There's a locked box. You've seen it before. I've seen Crow work before, he said. 2 years ago outside of Miles City. Different name, same coat. He paused. I didn't have cause to stop him then. Didn't have a badge and wasn't sure enough of what I was seeing. But you're sure now? I was sure the moment I saw you on that road. Grace looked at the side of his face. He was still watching the wagon below his jaw, set his eyes steady. He had said it the way he said most things, without performance, without the expectation that she would respond to it with gratitude. He had said it because it was true. The box is locked, she said. Do you have a key? No, but I have something better. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Bill of sale. Carver Ranch for a bay horse sold to one Silas Crow in November of last year. Crow bought a horse from us and never paid the full amount. I have the right to recover property from that wagon equal in value to the outstanding balance. Grace stared at him. You've been planning this. Since this morning, he said, when you started looking at me the way you looked at that wagon seat. She did not know what to do with him. She had been prepared since the road for every kind of man that a man in his position might turn out to be. She had been prepared for the man who wanted payment of a different kind. She had been prepared for the man who meant well, but would eventually decide he knew better. She had been prepared for the man who would hand her over himself eventually, when keeping her became inconvenient. She had not been prepared for this. For a man who moved chess pieces she could not see and did not announce, who had been 3 steps ahead of her since the moment he cleaned her hands by the stove, who seemed to understand not just what she needed, but why she needed it, and what it would cost her not to have it. You're going to go down there, she said. Yes. And produce a bill of sale for a horse. Yes. And Crow is going to know exactly what you're doing. Yes, Elias said. And he's also going to know that if he moves against me on a legal recovery, he opens his wagon to inspection. Which means his actual ledger, not just his contract copies, becomes visible. He looked at her. He'll let me take the box. He'll let me walk away because the alternative is worse for him. And then we ride for Delwood, he said. And we don't stop. Grace pressed her hand flat against her belly. The baby moved, not the alarmed stillness, not the restless nighttime movement, but something deliberate and strong, the kind of movement that always made Grace think her daughter was listening and registering her opinion. She agrees, Grace said. Elias looked at her hand. Something moved across his face that she did not have a name for yet. Then I'll be quick, he said, and stood up and walked down toward the wagon like a man who had an appointment. She watched from the ridge. She watched Crow emerge from the south tree line at almost exactly the moment Elias reached the wagon. She watched the 2 men face each other, and she could not hear the words, but she could read the posture: Crow tight and compressed the way he always was, and Elias loose and still, which was its own kind of language entirely. She watched Crow's man by the wagon front step closer, and then stop when Elias glanced at him without turning his head. She watched Crow take the paper and read it, and fold it and hand it back. She watched Crow say something that made his man's hand move toward his coat. She watched Elias say one sentence. Whatever it was, the hand stopped moving. Then Elias stepped up onto the wagon, crouched below the seat board, and came back up with a locked brown box tucked under his arm, like it was nothing more remarkable than a book he had been borrowing. Crow said something else. Elias stepped down from the wagon and answered without looking at Crow again, which was the most profound dismissal Grace had ever seen performed without a single dramatic gesture. He simply walked away back up the ridge carrying the box, and Crow stood below, watching him with the expression of a man recalculating a cost he had thought he understood. When Elias reached the top of the ridge and crouched back down beside her, Grace let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "At the end?" "I told him that Judge Price was arriving in Delwood in 8 days, Elias said, tucking the box into the saddlebag, "and that I had already sent word ahead." Grace looked at him. "Had you?" "No," he said. "But Crow doesn't know that, and now he has to decide if it's a bluff and how much it costs him if it isn't. That buys us time." "It buys us a day," he said. "Maybe 2. Then he'll decide it was a bluff and come after the box." He stood and looked at her with that direct look. "We need to move." They rode north. The cold was something you stopped fighting eventually, and simply wore like a second coat you hadn't chosen. Grace had Elias's coat again, and her own dress, and the heat of the horse beneath her, and the baby was still and quiet, in the way that felt less alarming now and more like concentration. The feeling of a small person paying close attention to everything that was happening and deciding what to make of it. They rode without speaking for a long stretch, and the silence was the kind that doesn't need to be filled, which was still new to Grace. Daniel had been a talker, a good man with words and stories, and silence with him had always felt like a pause in a conversation rather than a thing in itself. Silence with Elias Boone was different. It had weight and texture and intention. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "You're going to," he said. 2 years ago. Outside Miles City. When you saw Crow and didn't stop him." She watched the back of his shoulders. "There was a woman." It was not a question. He was quiet for a long moment. "Her name was Clara Hendricks," he said. "She was 16. She had a father who owed more than he could pay." A pause. "I saw her in the back of his wagon. I didn't know enough yet to know what I was seeing. By the time I figured it out, they were 3 days gone." "Did you look for her?" "For 6 weeks," he said. "Found the family she was sold to. Found that she'd run away from them after 2 months. Never found her after that." Grace was quiet. "I kept the badge," he said. "Figured someday it might be useful." She understood then that this was not an accident exactly. Not the fence line, not the ridge above the road, not the bill of sale already in his coat, not the fact of him being 2 years on this particular range. She understood that Elias Boone had put himself in a position where he could not miss it again, whatever it turned out to be, and that she was not the first woman whose road he had been watching for only the first one he had reached in time. "Clara Hendricks," Grace said. "Yes." "I'll remember her name," Grace said. "When I'm in front of that judge, I'll remember her name." He didn't say anything to that, but she saw his shoulders settle very slightly the way a person settles when they have been carrying something for a long time, and someone has just acknowledged what it weighs. They reached Ruth Bell's place at sundown. Ruth Bell was 61 years old and had been alone on her ranch in the Montana foothills since her husband died of a stroke pulling a horse out of a gully 8 years back. She was a small, compact woman with gray hair worn in a practical braid and hands that moved with the brisk certainty of someone who had been solving problems without assistance for most of her adult life. She was also, as it turned out, the frontier healer Elias had mentioned. And when she opened the door and saw Grace on the horse and read the whole situation in approximately 4 seconds, she said, "Get her inside, Boone, and put the horses around back where they can't be seen from the road." She did not ask questions until she had Grace sitting at the table by the stove with hot broth in front of her and a lamp lit and the curtains drawn. Then she sat across from Grace, folded her hands and said, "How far along?" 8 months, Grace said. "Maybe closer to 9. Any pain?" "Cramps today. I didn't say anything." Ruth looked at Elias, who had come in after seeing to the horses and was standing just inside the door. "She rode how far?" 6 miles, he said. "In December." "Yes." Ruth looked back at Grace with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to say what she is actually thinking. She settled on a portion of it. "You're strong," she said. "That matters." "I need to be stronger," Grace said. "I need 8 more days." "You need to rest," Ruth said. "Which is different from giving up. Your body is doing something that takes more energy than riding cold country, and you have been doing both at once since this morning. So tonight you sleep. Tomorrow we'll talk about what 8 days looks like." Grace wanted to argue. She could feel the argument ready in her chest. The same argument she had been making to herself since the road, that there was no time, that Crow was behind them, that resting was a luxury for people who were not being hunted. But the broth was hot, and the stove was warm, and the baby had gone quiet with the particular quality of quiet that meant this is acceptable. This will do, and Grace was so tired that her hands were shaking around the cup. "One night," she said. "One night," Ruth agreed, which meant something different coming from her. Grace would learn Ruth Bell's "one night" had a way of expanding to include exactly as much as was necessary, no more and no less, and she had been practicing that particular measurement for 61 years. Elias took the brown box from his saddlebag and set it on the table without comment. Ruth looked at it. "What's that?" "A ledger," Grace said. "Belonging to the man who bought me." Ruth looked at the box for a long moment, then at Grace, then at Elias. "You want me to open it?" she said. "I want to open it," Grace said. "But I need a pry bar or a strong knife, and I want a witness." Ruth stood up, went to the shelf above the sink, and came back with a short, heavy-bladed knife. She set it on the table in front of Grace without ceremony. Grace looked at the box. She looked at the lock. She thought about Crow's face above the wagon when he had said, "Load her before sundown," and the impersonal practiced grip of his man's hand on her arm, and her brother's face turned away on the frozen road. She picked up the knife and broke the lock open in 2 tries. The ledger inside was worn at the corners and full from front to back. Names in 2 columns, dates in a third, amounts in a fourth. Some of the names had notes beside them, in a cramped, careful hand, delivered, paid in full. Returned, resold. Deceased. Grace read the word deceased beside a name she did not recognize and felt something go cold and certain in her chest. Not grief exactly. More like the place where grief had already been and had left behind something harder. She turned to the most recent pages, found her own name. Samuel's signature beside it. She could see immediately that it was his handwriting pretending to be hers, the G curving wrong. She turned back to the front of the ledger, counted the names. 43 women, 43 names, dates going back 7 years. She closed the ledger and set it on the table and put her hand flat on the cover and held it there. Ruth Bell was watching her. Elias was watching her. "He's been doing this for 7 years, Grace said. Her voice was level. 43 women that I can count." Neither of them said anything. "I want every one of those names read into Judge Price's record," Grace said. "Not just mine, all of them. Every single name." "Grace," Elias said quietly. "I am serious," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She looked up at him. "I was going to say," he said carefully, "that you just broke open a ledger that Crow is going to want back badly enough to stop being careful about it. Which means the 2 days I bought us on that ridge are probably down to 1. Grace looked at the ledger under her hand. "Then we leave before dawn," she said. Ruth Bell reached across the table and picked up the ledger and tucked it under her arm. "I'll copy the first 10 pages tonight," she said with the brisk practicality of a woman who has spent 61 years doing what needed to be done. "In case anything happens to the original. I have good ink and better handwriting than most circuit court clerks." Grace stared at her. "Elias said you'd be the kind of woman who thinks 3 steps ahead," Ruth said without looking up. "I wanted to see if he was right." She went to the shelf for paper. He was. Elias met Grace's eyes across the table. He did not say "I told you so." He did not say anything at all. He just looked at her with that direct look that she was starting despite herself, and all her very reasonable reasons not to find steadying in the way that solid ground is steadying after a long time at sea. Grace looked back at the table. She turned the cup of broth in her hands. She was thinking about tomorrow, and Crow and the road north, and 7 years of 43 names. She was thinking that she was 8 months pregnant, 3 days off a frozen road, in possession of evidence that could end a man's operation, and possibly his freedom with 1 night's rest between here and everything that came next. She pressed her hand to her belly. The baby pressed back. All right, Grace thought. All right then. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods and found no leaves to take, and somewhere south of them, on a road that Grace Whitaker had bled on and stood up from and walked away from, Silas Crow was making his own calculation, and the number he kept arriving at was the same number it had been since the ridge. He was not done. He was only deciding when. They left Ruth Bell's before the sky had any color in it. Ruth had pressed a wool blanket into Grace's arms without asking, and a packet of dried herbs into Elias's coat pocket with specific instructions about what to brew if Grace's cramps returned, and she had stood at the door in the dark, watching them ride out with the expression of a woman who had learned long ago that the most useful thing she could do for people leaving into danger was not to say anything that would slow them down. The copied pages were folded inside Grace's dress against her skin, where they would stay warm and dry, no matter what happened to the original ledger in Elias's saddlebag. It had been Ruth's idea. Grace had not argued. They had covered 2 miles in silence before Elias said without preamble, "He'll try the river crossing." Grace had been thinking the same thing. "Because it's the only road into Delwood that he can block with 2 men. 3 men, Elias said. "He picked up someone in the night. I heard a horse on the south ridge around 2 in the morning." Grace looked at him. "You didn't sleep." "I slept enough." "Elias, there's a second crossing," he said. 4 miles east. Shallower. Not on any map Crow would have bought. But you know it. 2 years on this range, he said, which was all the explanation he ever gave for anything, and Grace had come to understand that it was always sufficient. The second crossing was shallower than she had hoped, and colder than she had expected, and the gray horse under her moved through it with the steady, unhurried confidence of an animal that trusted its rider absolutely, which Grace found she was relying on more than she wanted to admit. The cold came up through her boots and through the blanket Ruth had given her, and settled in her knees and her lower back with a dull, grinding permanence that she breathed through and did not mention. The baby was still. Not the alarmed stillness, the concentrating stillness. Grace had decided that this particular kind of quiet was her daughter's way of saying, "I am paying attention. Keep going." They were on the east bank, the horses shaking water from their legs, when Elias held up one hand and stopped. Grace stopped behind him and did not ask. She waited. 40 seconds. Then he relaxed one increment and urged his horse forward. "What was it?" she asked. "Smoke," he said. "From the ridge. Someone built a fire too big for the cold. Crow's man. Warming up," he said, "which means he's been out there since before dawn, which means Crow knows exactly where we are." Grace felt the cold in her back shift into something sharper. "He knew about the east crossing." "No," Elias said. "He knows about the road we're not on, and when we don't come, he'll start looking for where else we might be." He looked back at her. We have maybe an hour before the man on the ridge figures out we crossed east. Then we move. We move, he said. What? An hour later they had the problem. The problem had a name, Deputy Len Castle, and he was waiting on the road outside of Delwood's eastern approach with a piece of paper in his hand and the unhappy look of a man who has been given a job he knows is wrong, but has not yet decided what to do about that. Elias Boone, Castle said, and he said it to Elias, but he was looking at Grace. I got a complaint filed this morning. Woman named Grace Whitaker said to be traveling with you allegedly in breach of a signed labor contract. Allegedly, Elias said. That's what the paper says. Who filed it? Castle's jaw moved. Silas Crow. Filed it with Sheriff Alderman at first light. And Alderman sent you. He did? Elias looked at Castle with the particular quality of a man who is not angry and is not surprised and is simply waiting for the other man to finish arriving at the decision he is already most of the way to. Len, he said, how long have you been a deputy? 3 years. In those 3 years, have you seen a labor contract that requires a woman to be transported in a canvas wagon with her wrists tied? Castle said nothing. Because the rope marks are still on her wrists, Elias said. And Judge Price arrives in Delwood in 7 days, and I have a ledger in my saddlebag with 43 names in it. He paused. You can take us in Len. That's legal, and I won't fight you on it. But I want you to think about what side of this you're going to be standing on when Price opens that court session. Castle looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Grace. He looked at her wrists where the rope marks were still red and clear against the cold whitened skin. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. I didn't see you come in from the east, he said. Road was empty when I checked. He turned his horse and rode back toward town. Grace let out a breath. Friend of yours, she said. Decent man in a bad position, Elias said. There's a difference. He moved his horse forward. But Crow will know within the hour that Castle didn't bring us in, which means we need to get to someone Price trusts before Crow gets to someone Alderman trusts. Who does Price trust in Delwood? A woman named Margaret Hale, Elias said. She runs the dry goods. She's been corresponding with Price's circuit court for 2 years, documenting land disputes and contract fraud. She's the one who told me about his record with forced contracts. Grace straightened in the saddle despite the ache in her back. She knows about Crow. She knows about the pattern, Elias said. She didn't have a name until now. Margaret Hale was 54 years old, and she had the quality of a woman who had been underestimated so consistently and for so long that she had learned to use it the way a card player uses a bad face, as a tool deliberately with patience. She was behind her counter when Grace and Elias came through the door, and she looked at Grace once, looked at Elias once, and said, Back room. Now, both of you. The ledger was open on her table within 4 minutes. Margaret read in silence. She turned pages with care, not quickly, her finger tracing the columns of names and dates and amounts with an expression that started at grim and moved toward something colder and more purposeful with every page. On the 12th page, she stopped. Eleanor Marsh, she said. Grace looked at the name. She lived 2 miles south of here, Margaret said. Widow. She disappeared 2 winters ago. Her boy said she took work in Billings. She looked up. The boy is 9. He's been living with my neighbor since. The room went very quiet. That's what this is, Margaret said, and she said it like a woman closing a door that she had been standing in front of for a long time. That's what it's been. She looked at Elias. Price is due in 7 days. I need to get him here sooner, Elias said. Crow filed a complaint this morning. He's going to keep filing and maneuvering until this starts looking like a civil dispute between parties rather than what it actually is. Which is what, Grace said, and she said it because she wanted to hear it said out loud by someone who would not flinch away from it. Criminal trafficking, Elias said. And fraud. And forgery. He looked at her. Your brother is part of it whether he understood the whole operation or not. Grace had been waiting for that sentence. She had been carrying it since the road, the weight of it, the particular heaviness of a truth you know before it's said. She nodded once. "I know," she said. "Margaret," Elias said. "Can you get word to Price?" "I have a writer I trust," Margaret said, already moving to the back of the room. "He can make it to the county seat in 2 days if the weather holds." She paused. "Price can move the session here early if I send him what he needs." "Send him the copy," Grace said. Both of them looked at her. Grace reached into her dress and pulled out Ruth's folded pages. The first 10 pages of the ledger copied by Ruth Bell last night, witnessed by Ruth Bell and Elias Boone. She set them on the table. "Give him something he can read in the saddle." Margaret took the pages, looked at them, and looked at Grace with an expression that was not quite surprise, but had all the components of respect assembled and brought forward without ceremony. "Ruth Bell has good handwriting," she said. "She mentioned that," Grace said. The problem that arrived 40 minutes later was 6 feet tall and had the badge of Sheriff Dale Alderman on his chest, and he came in the front door of Hale's Dry Goods with Silas Crow 3 steps behind him and 2 of Crow's men in the doorway, and he said in the voice of a man delivering a decision that had already been made for him, "Grace Whitaker, you're coming with me." Grace did not move. Elias stepped forward, and to the left, the particular positioning of a man who is placing himself without blocking anyone's sightlines, which was its own kind of statement. "On what cause?" Elias said. "Breach of contract," Alderman said. "Theft of property from Mr. Crow's wagon, and suspicion of fraud against a lawful business." He did not look at Elias when he said it. He was looking at Grace. Crow was looking at the saddlebag on the floor beside Elias's chair. "The woman stole my property," Crow said. He said it pleasantly. He always said everything pleasantly. "All I want is what belongs to me returned, and the contract honored." "She is not a contract," Elias said. "The ledger," Crow said, still pleasant. "The locked box from my wagon. That is what I am referring to." "The locked box which you allowed me to recover as payment for an outstanding horse debt," Elias said. "The transaction you agreed to, in front of 2 witnesses." Crow's pleasantness developed a thin place in it. "A recovery that was conducted under false pretense." "A recovery conducted under a valid bill of sale," Elias said, "which I have." Alderman looked between them with the expression of a man who has been handed a situation that is significantly more complicated than the one he was told to handle. "Boone," he said, "if you have documentation, you can present it to the court. In the meantime, Sheriff." Margaret Hale's voice from behind the counter was level and unhurried, and had the quality of something that had been decided before it was spoken. "Before you take anyone anywhere, I want you to look at something." She set the original ledger on the counter. She opened it to the page with Eleanor Marsh's name. "You know that name," she said to Alderman, "not a question." Alderman looked at the page. "Eleanor Marsh disappeared 2 winters ago," Margaret said. "There is a 9-year-old boy 2 miles north of here who has not seen his mother since." She turned the page. She found another name. "Sarah Coles. Vanished from the Delwood area 3 years back. Her husband was told she ran off." She turned another page. "Agnes Pryor. Her family still puts a lamp in the window." The room was very quiet. Crow's pleasantness was gone now. In its place was something careful and watchful and very still. "Those names," he said, "are workers under legal agreements who fulfilled their contracts and moved on. Their whereabouts afterward are not my deceased," Grace said. Every head turned. She was standing with the ledger which she had lifted from the counter while Alderman was reading, and she was reading aloud from the column beside Agnes Pryor's name. "That is what the note says beside Agnes Pryor's name. In your handwriting, deceased." She looked at Crow. "What does that mean, Mr. Crow? What does it mean when you write that word beside a woman's name in your private ledger?" Crow said nothing. "Because it seems to me," Grace said, and her voice was steady in the way that something is steady when everything beneath it has made a decision and does not intend to unmake it, that a man running a legal business operation does not need to note in a private locked record that a worker has died. That is the kind of notation a man makes when he knows something happened that he does not want anyone else to know. Alderman was looking at Crow now. "Dale," Crow said, and the pleasant tone was back working hard. "You know me. You know what I run. This woman is upset and frightened and making—" "She was sold," Elias said. "Her brother forged her signature. The G in Grace on that contract curves the wrong direction. You can look at it yourself." He reached into the saddlebag and produced the contract and set it on the counter beside the ledger. Her signature beside the ledger's copy. One written by Grace Whitaker. One written by her brother pretending to be her. You don't need a court to see which is which. Alderman looked at the two signatures for a long moment. Then he looked at Crow. "Silas," he said, and the word came out differently than it had before. Not the word of a man addressing a business contact, but the word of a man who is looking at something and understanding for the first time what he has been standing next to. "I need you to step outside." "Dale." "Outside," Alderman said. "Now, both your men too." Crow looked at the ledger. He looked at Elias. He looked at Grace. And what he looked at her with was not anger or calculation, or the impersonal assessment of a man looking at something he has paid for. He looked at her with the specific cold attention of a man who is revising his understanding of what she is, and what she is capable of, and what that is going to cost him. Then he turned and walked out the door. The two men in the doorway followed. Alderman let out a long breath. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the contract. He looked at Grace, who was still standing with the ledger open in her hands, because she had not decided yet that it was safe to put it down. "I'm going to need you to stay in Delwood," Alderman said. "Both of you, until Price arrives." "We're not going anywhere," Elias said. "I need the ledger secured," Alderman said. "It stays with me," Grace said. Alderman looked at her. Then he looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. Alderman nodded once and put his hat back on. "I'll post a man outside Hale's tonight," he said. He said it to Grace. "Not to hold you, to keep Crow's men away." He walked out. Margaret immediately locked the front door. Grace set the ledger on the counter and put both palms flat on it, and held herself there for a moment, just breathing, while the baby moved beneath her ribs with the particular emphatic quality that she had started to think of as approval. "7 days, she said. 7 days, Elias said from behind her. "He'll try again before that," she said. "He looked at me when he walked out. I know. He's not done." "No," Elias said. "But neither are you." She turned to look at him. He was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his hat in his hands, and there was something in his face that was not the careful, managed stillness he usually wore. Something that had come through despite himself, some quality of feeling that he had not meant to let be visible. She looked at it. He looked back at her and did not try to put it away. "Elias," she said. "Why are you still here?" He considered that for a moment, not defensively. Carefully, the way he did everything, the way a man does something when the answer matters. "Because you haven't asked me to leave," he said. Margaret made a quiet sound that was not quite a cough, and moved to the far end of the store with the sudden industry of a woman who has found something very important to organize on a high shelf. Grace looked at the ledger under her hands. She thought about Clara Hendricks, whose name Elias had carried for 2 years on a range that had nothing else particular to recommend it. She thought about Eleanor Marsh's 9-year-old boy with a lamp in the window. She thought about 43 names and 7 years and a man with a good coat who had learned exactly how to make something terrible look respectable. She thought about Elias Boone, who had seen her blood on a frozen road and followed it, and had not once since that moment asked for anything back. "There are 6 days left," she said. "Yes," he said. "Crow is going to try to move before Price arrives. He's going to try to make this look like a dispute, or make me look like something other than what I am." "Yes," Elias said. "If he goes after Samuel." "Samuel will fold," Elias said carefully. "He doesn't have the spine for a long fight. Crow knows that." "Samuel will tell Crow whatever he needs to hear to make his own part smaller," Grace said. "Which means Crow will have a witness who says the contract was legitimate. Samuel's word against mine. Samuel's word against yours, the ledger. Ruth Bell's copies 2 witnesses to the recovery of the box, and a deputy who didn't bring you in when he was sent to, Elias said. That is a different calculation. Grace was quiet for a moment. I want to talk to Samuel, she said. The room went very still. Before the hearing, she said, I want to look at him, and I want him to understand what he did, not for the court, for me. Elias did not tell her it was a bad idea. He did not tell her it was dangerous or inadvisable, or that she needed to think about the baby. He just looked at her with that direct look and nodded once in the way of a man who has decided that the woman in front of him knows her own mind and deserves to exercise it. I'll find out where he's staying, he said. It took him an hour. Samuel Whitaker was at the Delwood boarding house in the cheapest room, the one at the back that smelled of horses and didn't get afternoon light. He answered the door at Elias's knock, and when he saw Grace standing there, all the color went out of his face in one motion, like water leaving a pan. Grace, he said. Invite me and Samuel, she said. He stepped back. They went inside. Elias stayed in the doorway, not entering, which was its own statement. I am here, and I am watching, and this is her conversation. Samuel looked older than he had on the road. He had the look of a man who had done something and then been alone with it for several days, and the loneliness with it had done more damage than the thing itself. His hands were not steady. I didn't know, he started. Don't, Grace said. He stopped. You knew enough, she said. You knew it was wrong enough that you turned your face away when they put their hands on me. You knew it was wrong enough that you couldn't look at me. She stood in front of him, and she did not raise her voice because she did not need to. You have a niece coming, Samuel. She will be born in this territory, and she will grow up in it, and someday she will be old enough to hear what her uncle did the winter before she was born. Samuel's face was doing something complicated and not especially dignified. Tell me one true thing, Grace said. Were you alone in this, or did Crow come to you? Samuel looked at the floor. He came to me, he said very quietly. After the 3rd night of cards, he said he knew I owed Harkins money. He said he had a way to clear it. He said it was a work placement legitimate that you'd be paid and could come home in a year. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. That is not the same thing, Grace said. Samuel nodded. He was still looking at the floor. I need you to say that to Judge Price, Grace said. That Crow came to you, that he told you it was legitimate, that you signed my name without my knowledge or consent. She waited until he looked up. Not to protect yourself, to tell the truth. There is a difference, and I will know which one you're doing. Samuel's eyes were wet. Grace looked at this and felt something that was neither pity nor satisfaction. Something quieter than either, and more tired. Will it help you? He asked. It will help 43 women, Grace said. I am one of them. She turned and walked out. In the hallway, Elias stepped back to let her pass and fell into step beside her, without comment, and they walked out of the boarding house and into the cold air of a December afternoon in Delwood, and Grace did not look back at the building. Her back was aching. The baby was moving in wide, slow circles, the way she moved when something large had happened, and she was sorting through her response to it. How long do we have before Crow makes his next move? Grace asked. Elias looked up at the sky, calculating light and time, with the instinct of a man who has read the outdoors for 20 years. Tonight, he said. Or tomorrow morning at the latest. He's not going to wait for Price to arrive and take the ground away from him. What will he do? He'll go after the ledger, Elias said. Not you, the ledger. Without it, the names are your testimony, and Ruth's copies, which is strong but not the original. He'll want the original. Then we don't keep the original in one place, Grace said. Elias looked at her. Give it to Alderman, she said. Tonight. Formally. As evidence in a criminal matter. Make him sign for it. Once it's in his custody, it is legally his problem, and Crow taking it from the sheriff's office is a different crime than Crow taking it from me. Elias stopped walking. He looked at her with something she had not seen on his face before. Something that was not calculation, not the careful assessment of risk and terrain, but something simpler and less managed. "You thought of that just now," he said. "I've been thinking about it since Margaret's," she said. "I just needed to talk to Samuel first." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Crow called you a runaway worker," he said. "I know what he called me. He is going to regret every single word of that," Elias said, and he said it with a quiet certainty that was more final than anger, and Grace believed him entirely. They walked toward the sheriff's office, and Grace carried the ledger against her side with the arm that was not aching, and the afternoon light was thin and cold and very clear. And 6 days from now, Judge Price would arrive in Delwood, and Silas Crow was somewhere in this town making a calculation that did not yet account for everything Grace Whittaker had already set in motion. He would find out. She intended to make sure of it. Alderman signed for the ledger at 4:30 in the afternoon, in front of Margaret Hale and Elias Boone, with a pen that scratched too loud in the quiet of his office, and a face that had aged noticeably since the morning. He wrote "received as criminal evidence chain of custody intact" in his log, and when he looked up at Grace and said, "It's safe here," she believed him in the way she believed a man who had just understood what he had almost been part of. She slept that night in the room above Margaret's dry goods, in a bed with 2 quilts and a hot brick wrapped in flannel at her feet. And she slept the deep, motionless sleep of a person who has moved every piece they can move and must now wait for the board to respond. She woke at first light to the sound of shouting in the street below. She was at the window before she was fully awake. Below in the gray early morning, Elias was standing in the middle of the street with his hands at his sides, and across from him were 2 of Crow's men. Not the ones from the road, different men, broader, the kind that communicated a different category of intent. Between them, held by the arm, was Deputy Len Castle, with a cut above his left eye and the stunned expression of a man who had been surprised from behind. "Let him go," Elias said. His voice carried up clearly in the cold air. The larger of the 2 men said something Grace could not hear. Elias did not move. Grace was already moving. She had her boots on before the thought was fully formed, and she was down the stairs and through the store and out the side door before she had decided what she was going to do, which turned out to be walking directly into the street and standing beside Elias, because the alternative was watching from a window, and she had never been able to do that. Elias glanced at her sideways. He did not tell her to go back inside. He had learned over 5 days that telling Grace Whittaker to go back inside was a sentence with no useful outcome. "Ma'am," said the larger man, and he said it with the kind of courtesy that is specifically designed to feel like a threat. "This ain't your business." "Deputy Castle works for Sheriff Alderman," Grace said. "Sheriff Alderman is holding evidence in a criminal matter at my request. That makes this entirely my business." "Mr. Crow wants the ledger returned," the man said. "Mr. Crow," Grace said, "filed a civil complaint that is pending before a circuit court. He can speak to the ledger's return with Judge Price." She looked at Castle. "Len, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Castle said, with the particular dignity of a man who is definitely not entirely fine. "They came at me from the alley." "From the alley," Grace repeated, and she said it loudly in the carrying voice she had not known she possessed until a frozen road in December had required it. She said it to the street, to the 2 women watching from the general store across the way, to the man who had stopped his wagon at the end of the block to see what was happening. 2 men came at a deputy sheriff from an alley at first light to prevent him from doing his duty. That is the kind of operation that Silas Crow runs. "Lady," the man started. "My name," Grace said, "is Grace Whittaker. I am a widow and a landowner and a witness in a criminal proceeding, and if you do not release that deputy in the next 10 seconds, I will add this morning to my testimony before Judge Price with your faces and your employer's name attached to it." The 2 men looked at each other. They let Castle go. They did not leave immediately. They withdrew with the deliberateness of men who wanted, understood that they are choosing to go rather than being made to go, which was a distinction Grace found she had exactly no patience for this particular morning. She watched them until they turned the corner. Then she turned to Cassell. "Where is Crow?" she said. Castle was pressing his sleeve against the cut above his eye. "Boarded up at the Alderman Hotel," he said. "The good rooms. He's been there since yesterday afternoon." "He's waiting," Elias said. "For what?" Grace said. "For us to make a mistake," Elias said. "Or for someone to make one for us." He looked at Castle. "Who else knows where the ledger is?" Castle hesitated. "Len," Elias said. "Alderman told his other deputy," Castle said, "Hicks, this morning early. Said he needed someone else to know in case something happened to him." Elias and Grace looked at each other. "How long has Hicks been a deputy?" Elias said. 8 months, Castle said, and the way he said it told Grace everything she needed to know about what he thought of 8 months. "Is Hicks bought?" Grace said. "I don't know," Castle said honestly. "I don't know what he is." Elias was already moving. "Get Alderman," he said to Castle. "Right now. Tell him the ledger needs to move." "Move where?" Castle said. "Somewhere Hicks doesn't know about," Grace said, which answered the question sufficiently, and Castle went. The ledger moved to the locked drawer of Judge Thaddeus Corey Delwood's resident magistrate, who was 70 years old and partially deaf, and had a reputation for being bribable under normal circumstances, but who responded to the sight of the ledger's contents with the specific outrage of a man who has been presented with something that offends his fundamental understanding of how things are supposed to work, and who told Alderman, in a voice loud enough to be heard through 2 closed doors, that he would sit on the thing personally if that's what it took. Crow did not attempt the magistrate's office, which was itself information. Crow knew what was in the ledger. Crow knew that the magistrate had now seen it, which meant Crow was calculating whether the ledger being in circulation was worse for him than what Grace was going to say without it. He was, Grace realized, shifting strategies. He was no longer trying to recover the evidence. He was now deciding how to discredit the witness. She understood this at the afternoon of the 5th day when Samuel came to find her. He came to the side door of Margaret's store, not the front, and he knocked twice, and then once, and then twice again, which was the kind of knock that means I am trying not to be seen. And when Grace opened the door, she saw that he had been drinking, not drunk, but recently close to it, the way a person gets when they have needed something to get them to the point of doing something they cannot do sober. "He came to see me," Samuel said. "Who did?" "Crow," Samuel said. "Last night. He was—" He stopped. He was very calm. He said he wasn't angry. He said misunderstandings happen, and men of good will can resolve them. Samuel's hands were working against each other, fingers nodding and unknodding. He said, "If I told Price that you had agreed to the contract, that you'd said yes yourself and changed your mind later, he would clear my name from the ledger entirely. I would have no connection to it." Grace looked at her brother. "He offered you a way out," she said. "Yes." "And you came here instead." Samuel looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something up a very long hill and is not yet sure whether he has reached the top or simply a place where he can put it down for a moment. "I thought about it," he said. "I want you to know that. I thought about it for most of last night. I want you to know because I am done pretending to be something I'm not in front of you." "I know you thought about it," Grace said. "You're not surprised." "No," she said. "I'm not surprised, Samuel. I know who you are. That's not the question." She looked at him steadily. "The question is, who you're going to be in front of that judge." He was quiet for a long moment. "He said something else," Samuel said. "Crow, he said that if I testified against him, he had documentation that I had been a willing partner in the arrangement, that I had taken money." He looked up. "I didn't take money, Grace. I had the debt cleared. I didn't think that was the same as—" "Samuel," Grace said quietly. "A debt cleared is money. Crow knows that. Price will know that." She let that sit for a moment. "What Crow is telling you is that he can make you look like a partner rather than a person he used. That is true. He can do that. But there is a difference between being his partner and being his fool, and the only person who can establish which one you were is you." Samuel's jaw worked. "If you don't testify, Crow walks away," Grace said. And there is another woman somewhere right now that he has already identified. And in 3 months or 6 months or a year, her brother or her husband or her father is going to get the same visit you got with the same calm voice and the same paper, and she is going to end up in that wagon. She held his gaze. Tell me that is acceptable to you. Samuel closed his eyes. It's not, he said. Then be in that courtroom, Grace said. And tell the truth, all of it, including the part where you had the debt cleared, including the part where you turned your face away. She paused. The truth is the only thing that protects you from Crow. It is also the only thing I need from you. Samuel nodded. His eyes were wet again. Grace looked at this and felt the same complicated exhaustion she had felt in the boarding house. The feeling of someone who has carried the weight of another person's weakness for so long that she has stopped being angry at it and has simply become tired. Go home, Samuel, she said. Be sober by the morning. Be in that courtroom when Price calls you. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and her hands on her belly and breathed. The baby was very still. Then slowly, a long rolling movement, not alarmed, not approving. Simply present. Simply saying, I am here. I am still here. I know, Grace said quietly. I know. The night of the 5th day was when Crow made his real move. It did not come with noise. It came at 2 in the morning in the form of a folded note slipped under the door of Margaret's store, and it was addressed not to Grace but to Elias, and Elias found it when he woke at his habitual 2 o'clock and did his habitual check of the doors and the window and the quality of the silence outside. He read it once. He came upstairs and knocked on Grace's door. She opened it immediately. She had not been asleep. He handed her the note. It said, I know about Clara Hendricks. I know what happened to her. I know where she is. Tell the woman to drop the case and I will tell you. Otherwise, what I know goes with me. Grace read it twice. She looked up at Elias. His face was doing something that she had not seen it do before, something that was neither the managed stillness nor the thing that had broken through at Margaret's counter. This was older and rawer and less willing to be managed. He found her, Grace said. He says he knows where she is, Elias said. That is not the same thing. Could he know? Elias was quiet for a long moment. He operated in Miles City 2 years ago, he said. If Clara was sold to a family in that area and something happened to her, yes. He could know. He keeps records. Grace looked at the note. This is a trap. Yes. He wants you to choose between me and her. Yes. And he's betting that you'll choose her, Grace said, because he thinks she's the reason you're on this range at all. He thinks she's your real reason for everything. Elias looked at Grace steadily. She is part of my reason, he said. I won't lie to you about that. I know, Grace said. I know she is. She folded the note carefully and handed it back to him. Here is what I think. I think that if Silas Crow actually knew where Clara Hendricks was, he would have used that information before now. I think this note is what a man writes when he is running out of moves. I think he found Clara's name somewhere in his own old records probably, and he is using it because he knows it will cost you something to ignore it, even if it's a bluff. Elias looked at the note in his hand. And I think, Grace said more quietly, that Clara Hendricks, wherever she is, would not want you to let him walk away. I think that is something you know already. The muscle in Elias's jaw moved. 2 more days, Grace said. Price arrives in 2 days. After Crow is in front of that judge with the ledger, and Samuel's testimony, and mine, his ability to know anything useful goes away. Whatever he knows or claims to know about Clara, we find through Price, through legal means, through the 43 names, and the 7 years of records that will become public testimony. Elias was quiet for a very long time. Then he put the note in his coat pocket. 2 more days, he said. 2 more days, Grace said. She reached out and put her hand on his arm briefly, just once the pressure of one person steadying another in the dark, and then she let go. She went back to bed. She lay awake until the light changed. The day before Price arrived, Crow tried 3 things. The first was a formal legal filing submitted to Magistrate Corey claiming that the ledger had been obtained by theft and coercion and requesting its immediate return as prejudicial evidence. Corey, who had spent the previous evening reading the ledger with a magnifying glass, rejected the filing in the time it took to say no, which was approximately 4 seconds. The second was a visit to Ruth Bell, whom Crow apparently believed could be persuaded to recant her witness statement on the grounds that she was a lone woman far from town and therefore vulnerable. Ruth Bell had opened the door, listened to approximately 30 seconds of Crow's calm introductory remarks, and then told him in language that Grace would later say she wished she'd been present to hear exactly where he could take his visit and what he could do when he arrived there. She had then closed the door, bolted it, and sent word to Grace via her rider that Crow was working the outlying witnesses. The third thing was the one that actually mattered. Grace was at Margaret's counter going through the ledger pages one more time. She had the names memorized. Now all 43 could recite them in order, which was something she had decided to do because they deserved to be carried in a living person's memory rather than only in ink when Margaret came in from the back with a look on her face that was unusual in a woman who was rarely surprised. "Samuel's gone," Margaret said. Grace looked up. "His room at the boarding house," Margaret said. "He checked out this morning. Horse is gone from the livery." Grace said nothing for a moment. "When?" she said. "Before 7, Margaret said. "He paid his bill last night, so he had been deciding last night, while Grace was reading the note about Clara, while Elias was keeping watch. Samuel had been in his room at the boarding house packing his things and settling his bill, and he had made his choice, and he had made it quietly, and he had left before anyone could say anything to change it." Grace set the ledger pages down very carefully on the counter. She had known this was possible. She had known it the way you know the weather is going to turn, not in a specific way, but in the general way of a body that has been paying attention to the signs long enough to read them without trying. She had known when she closed the door on him that the sober, clear-eyed Samuel she had spoken to was also the same Samuel who had turned his face away on the road, and that those two things lived in the same man and would always be in contest with each other. She had not known which one would win. Now she did. "He told Crow," she said. "Not a question." "We don't know that," Margaret said carefully. "He left before 7, Grace said. "Crow filed with Corey at 8. Corey told me the filing was new this morning, detailed in ways that were specific." She looked at Margaret. Specific about where the ledger had been moved. Specific about Ruth Bell's copied pages. Specific about things that only a few people knew. She paused. "Samuel knew all of it. I told him when I was trying to convince him to testify. I told him because I trusted him." She said that last sentence without inflection, without self-pity, and that was the hardest part, the perfect absence of surprise. Margaret came around the counter and stood beside her. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there. Which was Grace had come to understand Margaret Hale's specific language for "you are not alone." "Crow has a witness now," Grace said. "Samuel will tell Price that I agreed to the contract, that I changed my mind. He will frame himself as a victim of my recanting." She put her hand on the ledger pages. "Which means these matter more than they did yesterday." "Price is a good judge," Margaret said. "He needs to be," Grace said. "Because what I have now is a ledger, a dead man's forged signature. Ruth's copies, Elias's testimony, yours and Castle's." She looked up. "And Samuel on the other side." "And 43 names," Margaret said. Grace looked at her. 43 women, Margaret said, who were real, who were taken, who were in that ledger. "Samuel can say whatever he wants about your contract. He cannot explain Eleanor Marsh's name beside the word deceased. He cannot explain 7 years of entries. He cannot explain the locked box and the coded notes and the transport records." She met Grace's eyes. "Samuel can chip at the corner of one contract. He cannot explain away the entire ledger." Grace stood with that. It was true. She worked it from every side the way she had always worked. Numbers, the instinct her father had called her. Counting mind, the thing that had made her the one to do the farm's books at 14. The thing that had caught Crow's forged G on her contract, and it was true. Samuel's testimony would complicate one piece of this. It would not unmake the whole. "I need to tell Elias," she said. She found him at the livery, rechecking the horses with the methodical care of a man who manages his worry through his hands. She told him about Samuel in 3 sentences, factual and clean. Elias listened. He was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he said. "Not what does this mean for the case. Not we need to adjust. How are you?" Grace considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am angry," she said, "and I am past it. And I am going to be in that courtroom tomorrow, regardless of what Samuel says or doesn't say." "He's a fool," Elias said. "He's frightened," Grace said. "I am tired of the difference between those two things being invisible." Elias looked at her. The thing that had come through at Margaret's counter was present again, less guarded now, something that had been accumulating since the road, and had reached a volume that his natural restraint was no longer entirely adequate to contain. "Crow told him something," Elias said, "about what happens to people who testify against him. I'd bet on it." Grace had not thought of that, and then immediately she had, because it was true, and it changed the shape of Samuel's departure. Not absolution, but context. Not forgiveness, but understanding of a different kind. Crow was a man who knew how to make people afraid. Samuel Whitaker had been made afraid his entire life by smaller things than Silas Crow. "It doesn't change tomorrow," she said. "No," Elias said. "It doesn't." He was looking at her with that look, and she was looking back at him, and there was a quality to the moment that was different from the other moments between them. Not less careful, but differently careful. The way a person steps carefully toward something they want, rather than away from something they fear. "Elias," she said. "Grace," he said, which was just her name, but he had said it twice now, and each time it landed differently. "When this is finished," she said, "when Price has closed the session and Crow is dealt with, and the ledger is part of the public record." She stopped. She started again. "I'm going back to Daniel's land, my land, and I am going to rebuild what was almost taken, and I am going to make something there that—" She stopped again because the thing she was trying to say was large, and she was a woman who had spent 5 days being precise, and precision was failing her. "Say it," Elias said gently. "I don't want to do it alone," she said. "I have been alone since October, and I was managing, and I would have kept managing. But I would prefer—" She looked at him directly, because that was what he had always given her, and she owed him the same. "I would like you to be there, if you want to be." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I have been on this range for 2 years," he said, "and there has not been one single reason to be anywhere else." He paused. "There is now." The baby moved. A strong, decisive movement, the most emphatic thing she had done in days, and Grace put her hand against it and laughed once quietly, a real laugh, small but entire. "She agrees again," Grace said. "Good," Elias said. "That's 2 of you. That's enough." The end. Judge Nathaniel Price arrived the following afternoon. He came on a bay horse alone without ceremony, which was apparently how he always traveled, and he was a lean man of 60, with a face like weathered good sense, and eyes that took in the Dellwood Main Street with the quick categorizing intelligence of someone who walked into contested rooms professionally. Margaret met him at the road. Grace watched from the doorway of the dry goods store as they spoke, as Price listened with his hat in his hands, as his expression moved through several stations, gravity recognition. Something that looked very much like anger contained within professional form. He looked across the street and saw Grace in the doorway. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once the way a man nods when he has understood something and has made a decision about it. Grace nodded back. She pressed her hand to her daughter, who was still now the deep, purposeful stillness that Grace had come to read as her daughter's equivalent of ready. "Tomorrow," Grace said quietly to both of them. Somewhere on the other side of town, Silas Crow was also watching Price arrive. Grace did not need to see him to know this. She knew it the way she knew weather, the way she had known every move he was going to make a half step before he made it, the way she had known since the frozen road that this was not going to end until she ended it. Tomorrow. The courtroom. The ledger. 43 names she had memorized in order and intended to say out loud. And Silas Crow in his good coat about to find out that the woman he had loaded into a canvas wagon and called a work placement had spent the last 6 days building something he did not have a category for. Tomorrow. She went inside. She ate. She slept. She was ready. Judge Nathaniel Price opened the session at 9 in the morning in the largest room Delwood had available, which was the back hall of the Lutheran Church, and he opened it without preamble, without ceremony, without the kind of throat-clearing performance that lesser judges used to remind the room who was in charge. He simply sat, set his papers down, looked at the room, and said, "We're going to do this correctly." The room was full. Grace had not expected that. She had expected the principals herself, Elias Margaret Alderman, Castle Crow and his attorney, whatever witnesses each side had assembled. She had not expected the 30 or so people of Delwood who had apparently decided that whatever was happening in the church hall this morning was something they needed to see in person. She recognized the woman from the general store across the street. She recognized the man who had stopped his wagon the morning Crow's men had hold of Cassell. She recognized faces she had seen in the 5 days of waiting. People who had watched from windows and doorways and said nothing. Who were here now, perhaps because watching from a window had reached its limit. Crow was at the table on the left with a man named Forsyth, who had ridden in from Billings and had the practiced calm of an attorney who had argued worse cases than this and won some of them. Crow was in his good coat. He had the ledger, not the original, which was in Price's possession, but a copy of its cover which Forsyth had produced. Somehow Grace did not know how, and which he was arranging on the table in front of him with deliberate visibility. Grace sat on the right with Elias beside her, and Margaret 1 row back. She had not slept well, but she had slept enough. She was wearing the dress Ruth Bell had lent her, clean-pressed dark blue, the kind of dress that said, "I am a serious person, and I am here for a serious reason." She had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and the baby was still, and she was ready. Price looked at Forsyth. "Counselor, your client filed the original complaint. You'll open." Forsyth stood with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in these rooms. He laid out Crow's position in crisp, clean language, a valid labor contract signed by both parties, breached by the worker evidence removed from his client's wagon under false pretense. He did not raise his voice. He used the word legitimate 4 times and the word lawful 6 times, which Grace was counting, because counting was what her mind did when it needed to stay in its body and not drift into the white place. When Forsyth finished, Price looked at Grace. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "you're unrepresented." "Yes, sir," Grace said. "I am." "You understand what that means in these proceedings?" "I understand that I will speak for myself," Grace said. "I have been doing it all my life. I expect I can manage it for 1 more morning." Something moved at the corner of Price's mouth. "Then proceed." Grace stood. She had rehearsed nothing. She had thought about what she was going to say for 6 days, and she had decided somewhere around the second night at Margaret's that rehearsal was the wrong approach, that the kind of truth she was bringing into this room did not need staging, only clarity. So she stood with her hands at her sides, and she spoke clearly, in the American vernacular, of a woman who had grown up on Montana land and married a Montana man, and buried him in October, and then survived December, and she told the truth. "My name is Grace Whitaker," she said. "My husband Daniel Whitaker died of fever on October the 14th of this year. He left me his land, his debts, and a child I was carrying, who will arrive in approximately 3 weeks. In December, my brother Samuel came to me and told me I needed to sign a work placement agreement with a man named Silas Crow. He told me it was a respectable position in Billings, that the wages would clear his debt and keep the farm." She paused. "I did not sign anything. My brother signed my name. The G curves the wrong direction. You can look at both documents and verify that yourself." She picked up both contracts from the table, the one Crow had produced, and the one from Daniel's papers that bore Grace's actual signature, and walked them to Price's table and set them side by side. Price looked at both for a long moment. "Continue," he said without looking up. "When I refused to cooperate willingly, my brother tied my wrists and walked me to Mr. Crow's wagon. The rope marks were still visible on my wrists 6 days later. Deputy Castle can confirm that. Elias Boone can confirm that. Margaret Hale can confirm that." She returned to her place. "Mr. Crow then transported me, or attempted to transport me, in a canvas wagon with 2 men to prevent my leaving toward a destination I was not told. That is not a labor contract. That is abduction. I respectfully submit they are different things." Crow's face showed nothing. Forsyth was writing something down quickly. "I will now speak to the ledger," Grace said. Forsyth stood. "Your Honor, the ledger is irrelevant to the specific complaint." "Sit down, Counselor," Price said. He said it without looking up from the 2 signatures he was still studying. "I'll decide what's relevant." Forsyth sat. Grace looked at Price. "The ledger recovered from Mr. Crow's wagon contains 43 names, women, with dates, amounts, and notations in Mr. Crow's hand. The earliest entry is dated 7 years ago. Several entries contain the notation deceased beside the woman's name." She held Price's gaze. "I would like to read all 43 names into the record." The room was very quiet. "Proceed," Price said. Grace read all 43 names. She read them slowly, one by one, with the date beside each and the amount and whatever notation appeared. When she reached Eleanor Marsh, she said the name and then said, "She lived 2 miles south of Delwood. Her 9-year-old son has been in a neighbor's care since her disappearance 2 winters ago." When she reached Agnes Pryor, she said the name and then said, "Her family still puts a lamp in the window." When she reached the names with deceased beside them, she said the notation out loud each time and let the word sit in the air of the church hall with whatever weight it carried. She reached the last name, her own, and stopped. "And the 43rd name," she said, "is mine, Grace Whitaker, with my brother's forgery beside it and the date of this past December, and an amount equivalent to $300 in cleared debt." She sat down. The room was not silent exactly. It was the specific sound of 30 people working very hard to stay controlled, which is its own kind of noise. Forsyth stood immediately. "Your Honor, the ledger's contents speak to a broad range of—" "The signatures," Price said. He held up both contracts. "Your client's attorney. In your professional opinion, same person." Forsyth looked at the contracts. He was a good attorney. Good attorneys do not answer questions they cannot answer honestly without damaging themselves professionally. "The question is a matter for expert examination," he said carefully. "It's a matter for eyes," Price said, and set them down. He looked at Crow. It was the first time Price had looked directly at Crow since the session began. And the quality of the look was the quality of a man who has reached a decision and is now simply proceeding through the steps that formalize it. "Mr. Crow," Price said, "I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, because the answer you give will determine what happens in the next 10 minutes. He paused. "The notation deceased beside those 4 names in your ledger. What does it mean?" Crow's attorney leaned toward him immediately, and Grace could see from the set of Forsyth's shoulders that he was advising against answering. And she could see from the set of Crow's jaw that Crow was doing his own calculation very fast, and arriving at the conclusion that he always arrived at, that there was a version of this that could be managed. "Workers whose fate I learned of after they left my employ," Crow said. "I maintained records as a business practice. You maintained records of the deaths of women in your employ," Price said. "Former employ," Forsyth said quickly. "As a business practice," Price repeated. He looked at the ledger, which was open in front of him, and he turned several pages with the deliberate care of a man reading something he fully intends to remember. "The coding in this ledger, delivered, resold." He said the word the way you say a word when you want the room to understand what it means. "Resold." He looked up. Mr. Crow, I have been on this circuit for 11 years. I have seen land fraud and cattle fraud and deed fraud and water rights fraud of nearly every variety this territory can produce. He closed the ledger. I have not seen this before. Crow said nothing. That is not a compliment, Price said. Then the door at the back of the hall opened. Everyone in the room turned. Samuel Whitaker was standing in the doorway. He had ridden hard. His coat was road-dusted and his face was drawn in the way of a man who has been arguing with himself for 20 hours and has finally come down on one side, not comfortably, but conclusively. He looked at the room, at Crow, at Forsyth, at Price, and finally at Grace. Grace looked back at him and said nothing. "Your Honor," Samuel said, and his voice was rough and not quite steady. "My name is Samuel Whitaker. I am Grace Whitaker's brother. I have testimony to offer." Forsyth was on his feet. "Your Honor, this witness was not listed." "This is not a formal jury trial, Counselor," Price said. "Sit down." He looked at Samuel. "Come forward." Samuel walked to the front of the room. He did not look at Crow. He stood in front of Price's table with his hat in his hands and his back straight, in the way a man stands straight when everything else about his body wants to fold. "I signed my sister's name on that contract," Samuel said. "She did not agree to it. She did not know what Crow's operation was. She thought—" He stopped. "She believed what I told her because I was her brother and she trusted me. And I told her a lie because Crow told me a convincing one first, and I let myself believe it because it was easier than looking at what it actually was." Price said, "And what was it actually?" Samuel looked at his hat. "He was buying her," he said. "I knew it was wrong when I tied her wrists. I knew it was wrong when I turned away on the road. I've known it every minute of every day since." He looked up at Price. "I am prepared to say that under any oath you require." Grace looked at her brother. She had not expected him back. She had told herself she had not expected him back, and she had believed it, and she had been wrong. Some part of her, the part that was still the girl who had grown up alongside this particular disappointing, frightened, occasionally loving man, had been waiting for this since she closed the boarding house door. Crow moved. Not toward the door. Alderman was already on his feet, and Castle and that avenue was closed before Crow fully stood. He moved instead toward his attorney, leaning in, speaking quickly, and Forsyth listened and then straightened and said in his smoothest professional voice, "Your Honor, my client would like to propose." "Your client will propose nothing," Price said. "Your client will sit down." Forsyth sat. Crow sat. He looked at Grace. Grace held his gaze. She held it the way she had held her own wrists on the frozen road through the cold and the rope, and the weight of the thing being pressed against her, not fighting, not flinching, simply not moving. She held it until Crow looked away. "Sheriff Alderman," Price said. Alderman stood. "You will take Mr. Crow into custody, pending charges of fraud, coercion, and trafficking as defined under territorial statute." Price was writing as he spoke, his pen moving quickly. "I am filing the complaint myself. I am also directing that his records, including this ledger, be preserved as evidence in what I expect will be a substantially longer proceeding than this morning's." He looked at Forsyth. "Counselor, your client will want more than you for what comes next." Forsyth said nothing. He had the expression of a professional who has done the calculation and has found that the ethical exit is both the only exit and also, in this case, the correct one. Alderman walked to Crow's table. Crow stood without being asked which was the last managed, dignified thing he did, and he allowed the handcuffs without resistance, and as Alderman walked him past Grace's table, he did not look at her, and she did not look at him, because they had already completed that exchange, and there was nothing left in it for either of them. The room released its breath. Samuel was still standing near Price's table. He had watched Crow's removal with the expression of a man watching the last consequence of a decision he has been dreading for months arrive at last, and finding that its arrival is both worse and better than the dreading. Grace stood. She crossed the room and stood in front of her brother, and she looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the road and the rope, and his face turned away. and she thought about the doorway at first light this morning and what it had cost him to walk through it. "Samuel," she said. "Grace," he said. "I'm sorry. I know you are," she said. "It's not enough," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." She held his gaze. "But you came back. You're going to have to live with the first part for a long time. You don't have to live with the second part the same way." She paused. "Go home. Be the uncle she can count on. That is what I need from you now." Samuel nodded. His eyes were wet again. He put his hat back on and walked out of the church hall, and Grace watched him go, and that was the last uncomplicated grief of the morning. Price called her back to his table. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I am recording today's findings in full. The contract is voided. Your brother's forgery is entered as evidence. The ledger is in territorial custody." He looked at her over his papers. "The 43 names you read into this record are now part of a formal proceeding. I will be writing to every county seat in this territory with jurisdiction over Mr. Crow's past operations. Some of those women may be found. Some of their families may have recourse." Grace held herself very still. "Some of them have the word deceased beside their names," she said. "I know," Price said. He said it with the weight of a man who does not put that weight down. "I would like those names to be part of a public record," Grace said. "Not buried in a proceeding file. Public, so their families can know." "I will make that recommendation," Price said. "I would like it to be a direction, not a recommendation," Grace said. Price looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "All right." He made the notation. He signed the session closed. Elias was waiting outside. He was standing where the morning light was strongest, his hat in his hands, and when Grace came through the door, he looked at her face and read whatever was there and said, "Done." "Done," she said. He nodded. They stood side by side for a moment in the cold and the light and the particular silence of a thing completed. "Price is filing himself," Grace said. "He's writing to every county seat." "Good. He's making the deceased names public." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Clara Hendricks," he said. "I asked Price to include Miles City in the correspondence," Grace said. "I told him about her. He'll look into the records." Elias looked at the street in front of him. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "Thank you," he said. "She deserved to be in that record," Grace said. All of them did. Margaret came out behind them with Ruth Bell, who had ridden in that morning in time to hear Grace read the names and who now appeared at Grace's side with the brisk, purposeful movement of a woman who has made a decision and is acting on it. "You're coming back with me," Ruth said, "before that baby decides the church hall is sufficient." Grace laughed, a real one fuller than the one in the livery, the kind of laugh that happens when the body finds unexpected room in itself. "I'm fine, Ruth." "You've been fine for 6 days in conditions that would put most men flat," Ruth said. "You are coming back with me, and you are resting, and Elias Boone is going to help me repair the fence on the east side because I have been putting it off since September." Elias looked at Ruth. "Yes, ma'am," he said with the gravity of a man accepting a court order. Ruth looked at Grace. Well, Grace said, and she stepped off the church hall step and into the street and let the morning hold her weight. Anna Hope Whitaker was born at Ruth Bell's ranch on a Tuesday morning, 17 days after the session closed, in the middle of a winter storm that had been threatening for a week and finally arrived in the night with the full commitment of a Montana December properly applied. She was born at 3 in the morning, which Grace later said was entirely consistent with her character, and she announced herself with the kind of voice that left no question about her intentions. And Ruth said, "There she is," in the tone of a woman welcoming someone she has been expecting. And Grace held her daughter and pressed her face against that small, warm, furious head and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing that language was sufficient for. Elias was outside. He had been outside since midnight when Ruth had firmly and without room for discussion removed him from the house, and he had stood in the storm and the dark and done what men do when they are waiting for something they cannot help with. He had checked the horses, repaired a hinge on the barn door, stacked wood that was already adequately stacked, and then stood in the cold, being as patient as he was capable of being, which was more patient than most men, and less than he wanted to be. When Ruth opened the door and said Elias, he was there before she finished the word. "She's asking for you," Ruth said. He went inside. He stopped in the doorway of the room. Grace was sitting up against the headboard with the baby in her arms, and she looked like someone who has been through a great deal and has emerged on the other side of it, which she had. And she looked at him with the direct, open, entirely unguarded look that she had been giving him since the day in the livery, the look that required the same thing back. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at Anna Hope, who was very small and very real, and who had her mother's particular quality of being present in a room in a way that demanded acknowledgement. "She has your look," he said. "Which look?" "The one that means she's already decided," he said. Grace looked at her daughter and then at Elias, and something happened in her face that was not quite a smile, but was everything a smile comes from. "Her name is Anna Hope Whitaker," Grace said. "It's a good name," Elias said. "I thought about adding another name," Grace said. He looked at her. "I thought about Anna Hope Whitaker Boone," she said, and she said it the way she said things when she had decided clearly without performance meeting his eyes. But that seemed like it was getting ahead of things. Elias was quiet for a moment. "It is getting ahead of things," he said. "Yes." "It's also not wrong," he said. "No," Grace said. "It isn't." They held that between them for a moment, the way you hold something that is both fragile and very solid at the same time. "When you go back to the land," Elias said, "you'll need help with the east fence, and the well is going to need work before spring." "I know," Grace said. "I'm reasonably good with wells," he said. "I know that too," she said. "Grace," he said. "Elias," she said. "I'd like to stay," he said. "If you'll have me. Not to own anything, not to claim anything, to work beside you and be whatever you want me to be, in whatever order and on whatever terms you set." Grace looked at him for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the frozen road when she first understood that his stillness was not absence, but presence, that his silence was not indifference, but attention, that his keeping of distance was not coldness, but respect of the most precise and costly kind. "I want you to stay," she said. Outside, the storm moved through and left the world clean and white and very quiet, and Anna Hope Whitaker made a small decisive sound against her mother's chest, and Ruth Bell in the kitchen made enough noise with the kettle to cover the fact that she was listening, which she absolutely was. By spring, the farm was whole again. Price's letters had gone to 11 county seats. 3 of the women from the ledger had been found alive and returned to their families. The families of 2 of the 4 marked deceased had received formal notification. Crow's trial was set for May in the territorial capital, with Forsyth no longer representing him, and 4 additional counts added to the original charges. Samuel had appeared at the farm once in February, with lumber he had cut himself, and no explanation beyond the lumber, and Grace had put him to work on the east fence, and fed him supper, and sent him home with nothing resolved between them, except that he had come, and she had let him stay for a day, which was its own kind of beginning. Margaret Hale had established, with Price's formal backing, a correspondence network for women in the territory who had encountered contract fraud or coercion. She had named it after Eleanor Marsh, and she had written to Ruth Bell about it, and Ruth had written to Grace, and Grace had written back with 3 names of women she knew who needed to know it existed. The well was finished in March. Elias had done most of it, and Grace had done the part she could reach, and Anna Hope had supervised from a blanket on the ground, with the focused attention she brought to everything, which was considerable for a person who had been in the world for 2 months. On the first warm afternoon of April, Grace stood on the porch of the farmhouse that had almost been taken from her and looked at the land that was hers, legally formally recorded in Price's court, with her name and her daughter's name beside it. And she felt the specific weight of a thing that has been fought for and kept. Elias came around the side of the house with the particular unhurried walk of a man who has been doing physical work and has finished it and is satisfied. He stopped at the foot of the porch step. He looked at her. "East fence is done," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched you finish it." "Did you have notes?" "Several," she said. "I kept them to myself." "That was kind of you," he said. She looked at him in the April light, this man who had followed blood on a frozen road and had never once, in all the months since, asked for anything he had not been freely given. She thought about what she had said to him in the church hall doorway, in the days after Price closed the session, when he had asked her what she wanted from whatever came next, and she had said, "Someone who understands that I belong to myself." He had understood. He had understood it the way you understand something that does not require explanation because it matches something already present in you. "Elias," she said. "Grace," he said. "Come up on the porch," she said. He came up on the porch. He stood beside her and looked at the land, and Anna Hope was inside with the sound of the particular contented noise she made in the afternoons, and the April air was cold enough to be bracing and warm enough to mean something. And the east fence was done, and the well was finished, and the farm was hers, and the land was hers, and the name in Price's record was hers, and the man beside her was there because she had chosen him, and he had chosen her, and the choice had been made freely by both of them on their own terms. She took his hand. He held it. That was all. That was enough. That was everything a woman who belonged to herself could choose to give, and everything a man who understood that was glad to receive. Grace Whitaker had been sold on a frozen road in December by a man who thought she had no more say in her own life than the land under his boots, and she had stood up from that road and walked forward and fought for every step of the ground between that moment and this one, and she had arrived here home free, whole, and choosing. That was the story. That was all of it. And it was entirely, finally, irreversibly hers.